This is an interesting one. So this is the first time I'm here, and this is the first time I'm doing this kind of setup. So I'm probably way more excited than you guys. Yeah, it's great to be here. I only got in this morning, so I flew in from Ireland, but it's a nice crowd. And I've already promised I'm not going to pick on him, so I'm going to try and find someone else to pick on. But yeah, a little bit about Runecast. Before I kind of go through the slideware and all of that good stuff, there's a couple of things. First of all, please ask questions, interrupt me, things like that. Believe me, nobody wants to listen to me for 45 minutes talk. Nobody. The other is we have a little bit of a different story as and how we got into cybersecurity and everything related. We're originally an infrastructure company. So Runecast started about 8 years ago as an IT operations management monitoring solution, right? Really with background focus on on-premises, VMware, very traditional kind of infrastructure set. Most of the founders came from that space. Still, even though when we believe Microsoft or Google or others, everything is in the cloud, I think we all understand and know that that's not really the case, right? So traditional VMware environments are still very much, what runs most of the critical infrastructure. And over the years, we've kind of progressed into starting to look outside of just best practices. We started adding security hardening guidelines, things like that. And over the years, we ended up doing vulnerability assessment, compliance assessment, and many other things, right? So what I'm going to go through in various stages is just, talk a little bit about ransomware and talk a little bit about how back to basics in terms of just understanding where your stuff is, understanding what's the sort of level of vulnerabilities you have within the environment. And I'm not necessarily speaking end user endpoints. I'm more speaking data center endpoints, like your data center environments, your infrastructure. What sort of vulnerabilities you've got there? What's your risk appetite and things like that? And how that translates into good security hygiene, right? Yeah, we don't need to talk about this guy. But again, a little bit about myself. I do run product at Runecast, and before I can't go there. Before joining Runecast, I was with SolarWinds for a while. Yes, I was with SolarWinds throughout the breach. 1 out of 10, cannot recommend. Not a great time, not a great place to be. Before that, I've spent some time with McAfee, Trend Micro, Symantec, the usual suspects, and now I'm with Runecast. But yeah, in terms of ransomware, look, I really don't like going through stats and numbers too much. I think we've all seen them 1,000,001 times, and if you pick 15 different sources, you're likely going to get 20 different numbers. That's unfortunately the way it works. You'll always see slight variations. But I think we can all agree that 2021 was probably the highest year when it comes to individual ransomware attacks and the overall damage it caused, right? But I think we all can agree that also towards the end of 2021, going into 2022, we started to see slight drop off, which is great, right? Numbers are dropping, so I'm done. We can go home. nothing else anymore. No, of course that's not the case, right? We see, and it reminds me a little bit going back to, I know we spoke, the person before me spoke about, malware detection, endpoint protection, things like that. It reminds me way back when we started looking at advanced persistent threats and things like that, when stuff moved from the traditional, malware-based attacks to way more sophisticated advanced threats and, longer lasting. And I think we're seeing the same in the ransomware space as well, where well, they get smart, right? It's a cat and mouse game, and we always keep adding things. We always keep adding new security measures, and everyone is reinventing, and they will adapt, right? And right now, I think we're in that space. But also interesting is the fact that there is a fairly large segment of ransomware that's directly attached to CVEs, vulnerabilities, right? When we think of ransomware, it's very often linked to phishing. It's very often linked to the human aspect. And while that's certainly true, right, there is an element of abusing and using vulnerabilities in the environment to then do lateral movement, to do credential harvesting, to do all of the next steps that are coming after that, right? And it gets more targeted, right? So what we've seen over the last probably 6, 8, 10 months is that even from a ransomware perspective, attacks are becoming more targeted, right? It goes after the critical infrastructure. It goes after areas where it's not the cutting edge technology, but it's what runs your business, right? We had AD earlier on, certainly one. My background initially was database protection. That's a really, really fun target for ransomware because that's where all of your stuff sits. And if that's gone, well, you don't really have an awful lot of options left, right? Same as with AD, right? So I think what we're seeing also is the fact that it gets a lot more targeted towards the high value targets, right? The things that are, really usually still running on somewhat, I'm not going to say legacy systems because everyone hates the term legacy, but still runs on somewhat older environments, very often because there's proprietary software that runs that you just can't quickly, upgrade systems. But that's where most of the critical infrastructure runs on. So, when we start looking at complexity of environments, let me ask a question. So, just show of hand, who has more than just an on-premises environment running?
You mean hybrid?
Yeah. And of course, I was expecting that, right? I mean, it's not news, but the problem that comes with that is the fact that you've obviously got different tech stacks, different operating systems, different infrastructure, potentially similar compliance requirements, or at the very least similar security requirements for various different tech stacks in various different places that very often are then you end up having to look at various different vendors and various different tool sets to try and figure out how you can stitch these things together and monitor, right? And of course, you've got SIEM, and SIEM is designed to collect all of that data, all of that information into one place and allow you to do, allow you to find the needle in the haystack, really. But it doesn't solve the complexity problem. It just helps you figure out the noise problem, really, right? Because it doesn't solve the problem of you still having to deal with multiple different potential solutions that may or may not work in the same fashion across the entire tech stack, right? This is a funny one because when we talk about ransomware and we talk about the connection to CVEs, so this is top 10 ransomware. Now, granted, I'm gonna asterisk this, and he was giving out to me earlier that I wasn't listening to him when he was talking, and now he's sitting there on his mobile phone. Just saying, no. But this is a funny one in the sense that, granted, this is from 2021, but I think it's very representative in the sense of if you just take the top 10 ransomware families and you look at the number of CVEs they translate to. Now you can make that translation in the other direction. You can think about it, well, what if I get rid of all of those CVEs in my environment? Well, I'll leave the rest of the thought process up to you, right? Because obviously the more you can reduce that, the more you limit the potential risk Yes, sir.
What's the overlap between some of these ransomware families in terms of CVEs? So is Locky-in, Cryptwall, you've got 66 and 64. How much similarity is there?
There's going to be quite a lot of similarity, yeah. You're still looking at, God, don't quote me on the number, but I think it was 200 and something across. I mean, if you would add all of them up, they come to about 600. Right. But I think you still look at, give or take, 250, 230, something like that, of individual CVEs that then translate into the ransomware strains. So it just goes to show, that just by looking at the basics of vulnerability management, vulnerability assessment, you can already reduce the risk in the environment quite substantially, right? And I was talking to a gentleman literally about 10 minutes ago or so. The one thing we are incredibly good at in our industry is bolting on new things. There's always something new that the security industry comes up with. There's always something new, which is, don't get me wrong, it's great, right? I mean, it fuels the innovation, and I think that's a fantastic thing, right? But of course, there's also a commercial aspect to that, right? And we keep bolting on new things. But I also think we're not very good at going back to understanding that some of the things are just basics, and they're just good hygiene and should be done regardless of any of the additional bells and whistles and additional things that you may or may not have in your disposal, right? Or at your disposal, really. We've looked at something similar earlier on. So I'm not going to go into everything here, right? This one will come up again later on, actually. But if you look through, let's say, anything before defense evasion, if you look through the steps there, you'll see the vast majority of the steps here, apart from phishing, you could realistically wrap up in your standard vulnerability assessment and maybe some security hardening, right? I mean, if I look at, we've got our 2 exploits for Tomcat, and we've got a couple of CVEs that are used for the privilege escalation. We've got some PowerShell scripts, and then we've got some PSXExec, right? So all of that, realistically, you could wrap up in vulnerability assessment, security best practices, hardening, things of that nature. We're not yet at bells and whistles. We're not yet at anything new. We're just literally doing the basics. And I think, of course, and I'm going to be similar, saying, hey, I do work for these guys, so I'm somewhat biased, right? But also, I think, just in general, it's really important to start with that basics. If you don't have that basics in place, you can bolt on as many new shiny things as you want. You're always going to end up with holes, right? I mean, that's just the way it is. So, good security hygiene. For me, those are 3 different things, right? So 3 parts. It's the visibility, unification, and preparedness, right? So what do I mean by visibility? That's quite straightforward. It's just know where your stuff is. Know what you've got, right? Whether that's private cloud, public cloud, database, file server, AD, data center endpoints, just know what's there. The amount of times I've spoken to companies over the years where, and that dates me a little bit, when we started looking at things like network discovery and all of those things 10, 15 years ago, where you started looking at what's actually living in the environment, the amount of long faces and white skin tones that generally produced was quite interesting. And that's unfortunately still the case today, right? I mean, there's certain areas where you know very well what's running in terms of your workloads, what you've got, but it's all of the stuff that you don't necessarily know is usually the stuff that causes you problems, right? Endpoints that have been spun up, workloads that have been spun up 6 months ago because of X reason, right? And then they're parked, not used again, and they will become a security risk very, very quickly. Especially in the cloud space, that's fairly common. I'm not going to name names, but I worked for a large security vendor. Again, not going to name names. We did internal audits and we looked at what we've got. And we found quite a number of AWS workloads that nobody knew who they belonged to. No idea. They just ran in that company's environment and, open to the world, SSH open, all of the things that you shouldn't be doing, right? And that was security vendor, right? And that's just, I guarantee you that's going to be the same for a lot of your environments as well. You'll find stuff, right? So it really starts with understanding what you've got, right? So, it doesn't matter where it lives, whether it's private cloud, public cloud. It doesn't matter whether it's, Kubernetes, whether it's operating systems, whether it's the actual infrastructure itself, the virtualization layer, orchestration layer, it doesn't matter. You've got to understand what's there. It doesn't matter where it is, right? Again, geographical and what type of asset it is, right? And again, what I said earlier on, like our background was infrastructure. So of course, this is something where I think from our perspective, there's a lot of passion around that, just understanding what the environment looks like and really be able to ingest all of that and be able to really understand what's there and what's your potential risk, right? Because again, I think we're really good these days at doing the endpoint specific, whether that's EDR, XDR, and a number of other DRs that we're now having. But I think, again, there's still the need to understand what's actually in the infrastructure and how that contributes to your overall risk. Because it doesn't matter if you put something on an endpoint. If I have access to your virtualization layer, I don't care. I honestly do not care. You can put on your endpoints whatever you want. I'll still get to whatever I need to get to. I can still deploy. I can still get a VM up with command and control, access to the outside. I don't care, right? So it comes back to, understanding your endpoints is important. There's no question about that. But equally, understanding your infrastructure is just as important because that's where most of your workloads start, right? For Christ's sake, bring your teams together, right? And by that I mean, we need to stop thinking in team-specific silos, whether that's IT infrastructure, DevOps, DevSecOps, whether that's any other team that you have. They gotta be able to speak the same language, look at the same data, and understand the same results, right? I mentioned, yes?
Very sorry to interrupt you.
No, go for it.
Don't take this the wrong way. It's easy to say bring your teams together.
Of course, yeah.
But obviously in the real world, not at all easy to do.
Yeah.
I guess what I'm trying to say is, does a tool bring teams together? It might make sense.
Yeah, no, you do. And I think the answer, quite honestly, irrespective of the company that I work for, is it depends on how you roll it out and it depends on what you do with it, right? I think everyone had the hope that SIEM solutions and SOAR platforms would bring a lot of the teams together. To a degree, I think that worked, but I don't think it worked for the practitioner that does the everyday work, right? It works really well for SecOps and for going through doing data analysis and understanding overall, but not for the teams that actually work, right? Because to be honest, let's look at the vulnerability side, for example, right? You've got your SecOps team that generally looks at, what's new in terms of CVEs, what's required. You've got your infrastructure teams who generally are on the receiving end of that, right? Because they're, I see heavy nodding there. They're the ones usually that have to deal with that. They have to roll it out. They have to make sure it's patched. They have to make sure it works. Do they necessarily work together?
Got 2 fingers.
let me put that hand away. But you know what I mean, right? They don't necessarily work together, right? And I think that's the underlying point I'm trying to make here is we got to figure out a way to get these teams work together, right? Irrespective of the product or the solution, right? I mean, it doesn't really matter, but in order to make that process as painless as possible and reduce the risk of errors and, also, touching on the AI concept from earlier on, as much as we can standardize what that process looks like, the better we can automate it, right? Aside from the AI side, but the better we can automate it, right? But yeah, it goes back to understanding that all of these teams have to talk to each other. They have to work to each other, right? Especially when you're starting looking at, right now I've got some containerized deployments, I've got some Kubernetes deployments somewhere, right? Whether that's Tanzu on VMware or whether I'm using VMware or direct or whether I'm using AWS, it doesn't matter. But that's generally another team yet again. You've got your general infrastructure team, you've got your, likely you've got an operating system team even, depending on the size of your deployment. And they're all different, and they all have different objectives. They all have different views, and your need to have things up to date and patched might not be at the same level of importance to them than it is to you, right? Because you might create more pain for those teams, right? Than is good, right? So getting those processes automated and getting those teams to kind of work together and look at the same data sets is going to help you a lot with that, especially with pushback, right? Either I'm really, really bad at this, or this crowd is really, really quiet because there's not much coming back. Not quite sure yet what it is. And then it goes back to preparedness, right? And this just lists out some of the areas. And granted, that might be a little bit small on the screens here, but I'm assuming these are all shared later on as well, right? So you can look at them a little bit larger, right? But these are some of the areas that when you think about going back to just doing the basics around good vulnerability management hygiene, those are the areas that you kind of need to look at, right? You got to understand what's your configuration drift. You got to understand how your configuration changes over time, because that's a tricky one, especially when changes can be made over a very, very long time without you picking much up at all, right? Again, that's a really good area where AI, anomaly detection, things like that can come in. But I don't think we're quite there yet. I don't think we're at a point where that's at a level where you could trust the decision making into that yet, right? You got to understand outside of just the configurations also how certain settings and how certain setups affect your environment from an operational perspective, because that could potentially cause risk, right? So anything that I can bring down with a DDoS is a risk. Now, does that necessarily show up as a security risk somewhere? Maybe, maybe not, right? It depends on how I look at it, right? It depends on what I'm using for that. So the point I'm making is you got to understand how certain changes in the environment, certain changes on the infrastructure will potentially have an impact on your overall risk, of, whether that's downtime, because yes, we were talking about ransomware in general today, but of course there's also the element of I can just harm you, I can just bring down the environment and, and ask you kindly for the check afterwards, right? That's another way, right? And that is a risk as well, right? So understanding, yes, sir.
One question, you've got a beautiful how do you scale? Because the issue about hybrid, to me, is about scalability also. Right? Even your on-prem vulnerability management is not that straightforward when it comes to large number of users. But we're now talking about a hybrid environment.
Yeah, I think that is one of the biggest challenges, I think. Again, irrespective, I'm going to, obviously, again, I'm biased, right? I work for Runecast, so I'm going to say, hey, this is great. But aside from that, I think anyone here heard the term CNAP? PP. Cloud Native Application Protection Platform. Anyone take a guess which analyst firm came up with that? Yeah, thank you. It's a bit of a mouthful. But what Gartner is trying to do, granted, is similar to what happened a couple of years ago now in the IT operations space, which is now it's called observability, right? Because it's this all-encompassing view of your IT operations. And I think that's where the initial efforts of CNAP are kind of pushing towards, is this holistic view of your security from both on-prem through cloud, containerized, serverless at some point, things like that, right? I don't think we're there yet. And from a scalability point of view, absolutely. I think the biggest problem right now, and I kind of have to look into the audience for that, is likely the fact that you have 4 or 5 different tool sets to do half of what you see there. Yeah, go on, please.
I can't shut up anymore.
No, good.
So, listen, so, wait, you need your hand in the man.
I need to put my steps in.
Good, because that was
I'll help you out some feedback.
Yeah.
Okay. Or conversation.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So really, I think you're going along the right lines. And listen, I've come from large corporates, so I'm excluding the smaller businesses, but I think we all suffer from the same problem. Visibility and coverage. If you don't have those 2 items, then yes, you are going to struggle. Once you have achieved at least, I would say, in the upper regions of the 90%, then you can start to really make progress forward. What's interesting about any vulnerability tool, it doesn't matter what it is a tool that enables you to use that as a tool to bring people together, along with other things. And I think that's what we're mindful of. I know for a fact that there's probably nobody in this room that works for their organisation that's going to plug in and turn on automatic updates for patching. It's not going to happen.
Why not?
Because of
No, I know, of course.
Right? Because of that.
Of course. Sarcasm, by the way. I'm German, but I can do sarcasm.
Because of those older systems.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's, for me, that's the challenge that anybody has. And also, it's being able to define the risk. So all of this is great, but if you've got older systems, older platforms, things like that, and you can't deploy, you can't update, you can't patch, then this has to be something which enables you to define the risk to the organisation, so that then you can say, okay, we can't patch, we can't do this, we leave that alone, but what we're going to have to do,
you now got to start, exactly.
and we've got to ramp up the monitoring, whatever it is it's going to be, that's what's got to happen. So I think we are able to achieve good coverage and visibility that does start to really answer a lot of questions, and then enables you to bring teams together. Now, whether they're going to do it or not is a different story, right?
There's a human element in that, yes, of course. Yeah, there's a human element in that.
There's more chance of people doing that. They understand what it is that they're trying to tackle, and also it means you can break things down into smaller chunks, which means it's much easier for people to address and understand.
No, absolutely.
There you go. Right?
Absolutely.
Give you some feedback.
It's great. Thank you. But at least I think you kicked it off now, so we've got we've got another one.
Thank you. Anybody else want to put your hand up?
We've got another one there.
So just on the previous slide, I don't think I saw. I don't know if you could just switch back to the previous slide. Just so
It's going to take me like 10 minutes to go through. Go back, but wait.
So when we're looking at this, when you're talking about the external team, are you talking about essentially every other person working in the business? So just
Yes.
General use case. Because the issue that I've come across with quite a lot of my clients is when I'm trying to get all of their teams working together, and they'll come to me and so one of my clients essentially said, we have 67% is likely going to be an insider threat in terms of our kind of risk appetite and our analysis that we've done. And I said to them, well, how do you look at cybersecurity culture? And they essentially seem to see it as an add-on to everything else technical that they do. And the problem that I'm finding is when an organisation looks at cyber culture and doesn't also take into account the fact that the non-cyber technical employees are essentially as important, if in some cases more important, in decreasing that cybersecurity risk, and they're just keeping it an add-on, they're almost doing it the wrong way. And so what I'm trying to do with a lot of my clients is to say to them, yes, it's going to take a bit of time doing discovery work, but talk about cybersecurity culture.
You have to.
And then once you've got that maturity, then start talking about the technical side of things. Because if you can't get the general user base on side with you, you can talk about kind of any tool that you want to and say, oh, this is going to be amazing for you. But if they don't use it, it doesn't matter.
No, absolutely. Totally agree. And that's kind of like the point I was making early on with the IT operations and the system admin segment of this equation is if you don't make this palatable for the practitioner there, it's not going to fly, right? They're just not going to take it up. But in this particular case, external teams is more around your external auditors, your external, pen testing, things like that, right? So, but yeah, that's a very good point as well. Yeah.
Rita, take the mic. Yes. Yes, wait.
Yeah, I can be loud. So prioritization is another thing, isn't it? So all these are good, you're bringing all the data, you've got the teams together, but you need a way of prioritizing where to start first. I think that's the key, that's another area where a lot of organizations are struggling.
Absolutely.
You've got all the data, but knowing how to use them, and where to use it.
Absolutely. So again, just
prioritization.
Thank you. But that's one of the key problems, isn't it? Right? Because I mean, it's not like we lack data points, right? I mean, we've got CVSS scores, right? We've got a lot of metadata in the CVEs, and we've got a lot of additional metadata as well. But one example I always use when I speak to people is, well, in a lot of cases it's academical, right? In the sense that, any given CVE could potentially be exploited, but it might require me to be physically in the front of the server, perform a handstand, and type with my right foot. It's exploitable, right? But how big is that risk really for me, right? How big is that risk for you? How likely is it that I have someone that goes in front of the server, performs a handstand, and types with the right foot, right? Relatively low. So what we need to have, what we need to have is a way of bringing all of those different data points together. So things like CVSS score, things like has it been exploited in the past, things like is there an exploit kit available for it? All of these different, not metrics, but metadata points, bring them together to allow you to do risk-based prioritization, because it's easy to do it on CVSS score. Everyone can do it, it's there, right? But that doesn't give you risk-based prioritization, it just gives you a number. So it's really bringing all of that together to then allow you to look at it, okay, what's prioritization from a risk-based perspective? And then you're much easier, it's much easier to, we have a lot of waving going on there.
Sorry, just want to get everyone in. Read that overview. Sorry. Thank you. Markus, read that.
Sorry, I just want to follow on and say, fantastic slide deck, by the way. But the way that's been
terrible,
but the way that I look at it is looking at the attack surface and looking at doing an attack surface management and targeting that, and based on the NIST scores, then prioritising. The CVs will be around for ages, and I don't think you can do any prioritising. And once you get the NIST score and you get the attack surface management in place, then all the teams can gather around because they're all focusing on the one thing.
No, absolutely. That's certainly one way to do it. You can do it through the attack surface management and do the scoring that way, or a combination of excuse me, combination of the NIST score plus internal factors that may or may not be that easy to roll into that. But definitely, you need to have some form. Sorry, you need to have some form of a risk-based prioritization, because otherwise it's impossible. Yes, sir.
Okay, yes.
Yeah, I was thinking. You talked about effectively the friction for the users earlier on. So, brilliant technical solutions, but I'm thinking, taking a step back and thinking, what do we do about social engineering and phishing? Can we educate?
Yeah.
So, I can't help thinking that from an end-to-end solution perspective, it should really start right at that.
Realistically, yes. Yes.
Get the buy-in.
Yeah. I can't, right now, I can't think of a single vendor in the space that would do end-to-end, right? I think we're getting closer to, and I'm not even saying a single vendor, but some form of an integrated solution. I think we're getting closer, but I don't think it exists yet in the sense that you really have an end-to-end solution that allows you to really look at the entire flow from, let's even start further, the culture, all the way into the phishing and human aspect of that, social engineering into the systems and the tech. I don't think in that form it exists right now.
Okay, just you and then Ramon, and then the tables at Aaron and T.
This is a question from me, Alan.
Yeah, sorry.
It's a good question. I mean, great slide and everything else, but as an example, how are you at Runecast achieving this? Mm-hmm. Have you got some examples of where
you can come over to the table as well, but let me just go back to one of the very last slides, because I think, there we go. So this is a snapshot of what Runecast effectively offers. And I don't really want to make this a pitch, because I'd like to make this just a conversation among us. But yes, the reason why we effectively bridge a lot of these gaps between the teams is because, well, we weren't a traditional cybersecurity company to begin with, right? We came from that IT operations spectrum and started adding on capabilities. So what we effectively do is we do provide end-to-end, at least from a vulnerability and compliance assessment perspective, across the entire tech stack in one place, right? So whether that's on-prem VMware all the way through containerized, cloud-based, and anything in between, right? And it's all in one place, meaning you are measuring with the same measuring stick, effectively, right? You're measuring with the same controls through the same way. I have a lot of feedback here. In one place, right? So but if you want to pop over, obviously I don't have any slides or anything on UI or what it looks like and things like that. Let's have a chat and we'll show you at the TV there. Yeah. I think I'm getting close to time.
Hold on, Ramon. Anybody else, folks, on that table? Okay, Jatin, I'll come to you. Ramon, you.
Yes, well, nice presentation. Just to share some thoughts on the reality that we are facing. I work in a small pharmaceutical company in Spain, in Barcelona, and we have a lot of obsolescence. Sometimes it's inevitable because it requires big investments, and sometimes it's because we're using a lot of biology software in the R&D functions, where they can only run on operating systems that are already obsolete. And that is inevitable. And sometimes you may say, okay, you should implement segmentation, but segmentation is not always feasible because especially...
You still need that stuff. You still need it to do something,
that's
right?
It. Between OT and IT, there are a lot of dependencies and you cannot just segment everything. So at the end of the day, vulnerability management becomes a big challenge despite of the solutions that are in the market. It was just to share this reality, which is sometimes frustrating.
Yeah, and it's really interesting that you bring that up again, because like I've mentioned earlier on, way back when I spent quite a lot of time in the database security space, right? Where that's extremely prevalent, because especially when you look at financial institutions and things like that, very often those systems run on really, really arcane environments. Like we're talking AS400, right? We're talking mainframe and Oracle 8, that kind of, and but it's impossible to move it away because the software cannot be moved. That's just the cost part of recreating that piece of software is effectively making it cost prohibitive. And it just ends up being this black hole of old systems. And it's also amazing to see how many vendors in the industry, and that to a degree includes us as well, so I'm not excluding ourselves here, have a tendency of always looking at making sure we can cover everything that's new, right? And making sure we can cover what's currently up to date in terms of vulnerability assessment. And we tend to forget the old stuff, the things that are end of support, end of life by the vendor for the last couple of years. But that's really where most of the risk sits, isn't it? I mean, that's where you got to know, because you don't really have much options there. Yes?
Sorry, Jatin first, and then you. Sorry, Jatin. Sorry.
Thanks. So just one question. Have you ever experienced something to say that I have a set of vulnerabilities, right? It could be related to cybersecurity, some may be related to some access-related inconsistencies. But to look at that from a residual risk perspective, so in isolation, that vulnerability is from micro attack perspective and in this framework, it's rated very high or critical. But there are compensating controls, right? So the residual risk associated with that
is very low.
Is low. Yeah. So is that something that you are having as a part? Okay.
Not in the sense of there is no programmatical way for us to map that out for you, right? Because we don't know your risk appetite, right? Because it will depend on, what would you describe as the additional controls being sufficient enough to reduce the residual risk, right? That depends on your organization's risk appetite. But we provide all of the controls to get you to the point of making that decision, right? Because we can map that out. We can't know that. Right?
I get that, and that's always a struggle for me, right? Yeah. So because it's specific to that application or that particular environment. But purely from a standards perspective, I'm not seeing that, and I may be wrong, right? That if these individual controls are there, if you have X, Y, Z compensating controls, the residual risk is much lesser.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
Is that something that you have experienced or controls on their own?
Yes.
Not related to the environment?
Yeah, also vulnerabilities in terms of requiring potentially additional libraries to be present in other parts of the environment to really be able, for example, to exploit things. So yeah, those are, excuse me, I was at RSA a week and a half ago. My voice still suffers, but yeah, I mean, yes, absolutely, because I think it's great to have a baseline that's binary, that's pass-fail, but reality likely doesn't look like that, right? It's not as binary as we would like it to be, right? So there always has to be circumstances that you can put in order to make this an acceptable risk, right? And we provide the information for that, yes.
Sorry to interrupt you. Your point, and then next to Carol, and then no, not you, Carol, next to you. Not Aaron, on your right. Yes, sorry, and one mic over here, sir. Thanks. Go on.
So this is never actually going to be solved. Cyber is now the modern day pharma industry, where we just solve medicines, but we're not actually fixing the problem. Until the software companies are held accountable for keep pushing shit software, we're going to have the same problem for hundreds of years to come.
Yeah.
So it's actually going to have to come from somewhere more like a regulation that actually solves this. But there's no interest in Runecast pushing for that, because then you're out of business.
Well, yes, of course. I mean,
it's been happening for 20 years. 20 years, the same problem, the same presentation I've heard in different ways, times over the past 20 years. Yeah. But unless someone actually
you look a lot younger than having been around for that long.
I'm not married, that's why.
There you go. Yeah, that must be it. That must be it. No, but you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And to a degree, no matter what way I want to look at this from a Runecast perspective, I'm just yet another guy who talks about this, right? I was married and I have been around for that long, so and yeah, we've looked at this 20 years ago, We looked at it 15 years ago, 10 years ago, and we're probably going to look at it again in 5 years, and in 10 years, and in 20 years, right? Because yes, there is no incentive as long as there is software that has built-in ways to get around your security measures. For that long, all of us will be in business, right? And of course, I could say, yes, we're, for all of the right motives, of course, we're interested in that. And yeah, on the human level, we are interested in that. Of course, we want to make sure that things are safer, right? But yes, it's a business, right? I wouldn't necessarily build a product to, put us out of business, right? That's a difficult one.
Almost close to the lunchtime. Any question there? And then, sorry, 1 second. Also, please look at your mobile Slido. There's a question on paying ransom. Yes, you, sir. Last one.
Just bringing the human element back into this. One of your slides was pitching a tool to bring all the teams together. In your experience, who generally pitch this to? Who would generally be interested?
Very good question. Who do you pitch on the slide deck to?
Responsibility for that tool, out of their budget, bringing multiple departments, multiple budgets together.
Yeah, if you talk budget holder level, then it's usually CISO, right? Because the CISO owns the problem, right? We've got a couple of CISOs in the room, right? Why are you shaking? You don't own the problem?
No, I absolutely do.
Right.
I'm shaking my head in despair.
But you know what I mean? Like, if it comes to that point of where it becomes an overarching budget conversation, right? Then yes, it would be the CISO. But realistically, generally for us, we don't pitch the overall solving world hunger and peace in one go. That's usually not the way it works. We start off somewhere within the different teams because of a pressing need of sorts, right? And then it ends up taking on, and other teams start using us, and over time it then becomes a CISO conversation. But it's not. We're not trying to go in and replace 20 things at the same time, because, like, if you have any sort of mid-sized to large environment, if you need to rip out 3 different vendors and do all sorts of different things to get the replacement up and running, that's a pretty costly exercise, right? It takes quite a lot of time, quite a lot of effort, and quite a bit of risk, because stuff could go down and things like that. So we generally don't. We try to avoid that. We rather kind of work with companies on kind of going through that process step by step, and replace where need be, and get teams together that way.